Our next topic, we're going to refocus on raster data. We'll take another look back at the fundamentals of the raster data model and start laying the foundations for raster-based analysis. Recall that the raster data model simplifies, generalizes the real world, as we see on the left in a black and white air photo, into a series of cells, the same size, the same orientation, mostly squares, but not always going to be squares. And each one of those cells represents something about the Earth's surface. And as you can see, depending upon the resolution of the cell size itself, it's going to vary in how well it can represent the Earth's surface. So it's very different from the vector data model. It has different properties that we need to keep in mind when we're using raster data for geographic analysis, but there are certain things that raster data is very well suited for, and that's why the model was developed in the first place. So with that general model idea in mind, what is it that raster is very good at? It's depicting surfaces, continuous geographic surfaces. So things like the idea of elevation, environmental properties like temperature and precipitation, things that occur across space that don't have gaps. So continuous forms of data, continuous geographic phenomenon, as opposed to discrete geographic phenomena, things that occur at particular locations. So buildings, for example, are really good in the vector data model, not so great in the raster data model. So that's what we use rasters for, studying a lot of environmental phenomena across the Earth's surface, in the atmosphere, in the ocean, that are continuous environmental variables across space. And how this data model works, again, kind of a review. Think of it like an XY grid or graph, and the X and Y coordinates describe where the different individual cells in a raster are located. A raster is a grid, an array of cells across space, describing space, that typically, but not always, have the same length of a side on all four sides. So, as the slide indicates, cell size usually is equal to A, is equal to B, equal to C, equal to D. Any of the sides of a raster are usually the same length. This is not necessarily the case. Some rasters are made out of rectangles, and some other types of modeling might use different geometric figures or features, different geometric types. But rasters that we use in this class fundamentally are going to be the square type. Okay. And so another thing to note about grids at this point, grids of rasters, cells, is that we're going to have a number of rows that go vertically, a number of columns that go horizontally. Those do not have to be equal. Those can be unequal. And so where we are in any grid cell location is going to be from an origin point somewhere in space, somewhere georeferenced to the Earth's surface. And it's just a matter of the number of rows you are away from it, the number of columns you are away from that location describes where the cell is. Cells are typically drawn from one of the corners. So you, in the grid file structure, it will know what the origin point is. Start there and start drawing these squares across space. And so how it knows where that is linked to the Earth's surface. And then it knows the distance that it's drawing each side. And so it needs an origin point from which to start drawing those raster cells, pixels, on the screen. So we have cells generally located in space. Now we need to think about what they actually contain, and they each cell in the grid or in the raster will usually have a single value, whether that's an actual value meaning something or a no data value, and that applies throughout the interior of the entire cell, no matter how that cell aligns with what we might think of as boundaries that exist between natural features on the Earth's surface. So, for example, here on the left, we have a vector representation of a parcel of land, probably different land use types or something like that. And the vector data does a really great job of establishing the boundaries, the margins between those different land parcels. The pixel may fall on the boundary line itself. It may encompass information from two different land use categories, 1 and 2. And so when we generate a raster from something like this, where does it get its value from? It's from whichever of those categories occupies the majority of the area of the individual pixel or cell. Okay, so here you see this is why it's such a blocky representation of the Earth's surface and of surface characteristics. With the square geometry, you simply can't do a really good job, at least at this scale or size of pixel, at modeling the same phenomena in the same way that vector data does it. All right, so there's an inherent flaw within the raster data. And we'll talk more about the ramifications of that throughout the next couple of lectures. So each cell in the raster contains usually a single value or no data that applies throughout the interior of the cell, and these are typically going to be one of two things. Integer data is really good for categorical information, nominal information, that you can apply just a single number to. Floating point is better for continuous surface data. So rasters are essentially XY graphs, in one way of thinking about it, that are showing us information about the Earth's surface, and they can be referenced to given point locations on the Earth's surface, just as vector data can. One of the things to keep in mind about this process that's really important for raster data is that the larger your raster array is, the more surface area that it covers, the more distortion is going to be included within it. If you have a massive raster data set that, for example, covers the entire continent of North America, it's going to experience distortion both north-south and east-west. Those cells are going to be stretched out the further north you go to the sides, and so they may be trying to represent the same surface area, but since the surface is curved on the Earth underneath that raster, you're trying to overlay on top of it, it's going to be stretching things out, and it's not going to be a great representation of the geographic feature of the continent. And that's even more so when you apply it to the global scale. Okay, so the smaller a study area is, the better a raster is actually going to represent true locations on the Earth's surface. The larger the study area is, the worse it's going to be able to be tied to specific surfaces and areas on the Earth's surface. Right? It's just there's going to be more and more distortion the larger the raster is. So that's something just to bear in mind when you're doing research at different scales and some of the limitations that you're going to experience if you need to use raster data. So let's think again for a few minutes about how these rasters of pixels are actually being drawn on the screen, what you're actually seeing. In order to draw a raster to visually display it, the GIS system needs to know at least two of the opposing corners that describe the outer margins of the raster, and given the cell size, it can then draw all of the intervening pixels that fill the array. So we have at least 2 points that we know, or must know fairly well, must be true measurements in space. And from those, then, we start drawing, given that pixel size, then we know the length of the side, any of the four sides of a typical raster pixel as a square, and then it simply draws those things out there and fills them with whatever values are coded into that particular cell location. Another way that cells can be drawn is if the raster is set up so that it knows the center point location of each cell and then draws the cell margins around it. Either way, you're going to wind up with a raster composed of individual cells or pixels containing whatever geographic information it is that was coded into them, that represent a continuous surface over the Earth. So let's think about one of the ways that we can generate rasters, and that's from point locations. And for example, if I was out on the landscape collecting a lot of information about a particular study area and I wanted to generate my own surface information based upon those things, one of the simple ways that things can be done is to take my GPS location and use it and say, where's the closest pixel center to that? And then that pixel takes on the value of whatever measurement it was that I made at that location. So on the left, we have an example of being out on the landscape, take a GPS point location, record some information about the Earth's surface, maybe the type of vegetation that's there, the dominant land cover vegetation. And then when I generate a raster, the code for that vegetation becomes the value for the new pixel that's closest to it. Over on the right is an example if I was within the pixel size that I'm trying to create and I took 3 observations, which one of those is the one that gets selected for the pixel value? You can set the system to record the nearest location. You can set it to record an average of the 3 within that pixel, and then that becomes the pixel value. Those types of things can be done here to create things from point data. There are other techniques that we can use for it, but if you have a dense array of points across space, you can rather easily create a raster from them using these different techniques. So with each cell in a raster representing a specific spot on the ground and containing a single value about the ground, the surface, it follows that if what you observe or the measurement, what's actually there on the surface, if that value is uniform across the cell, then the raster cell is accurate, truthful, telling you what is actually out there in space. Quite often, though, as we saw just a few slides ago in a real basic example, there can be a lot of variation in the land surface and margins between different surface features, like vegetation patterns changing on a mountainside or something like that. And so any given cell may actually be comprised of information from different geographic phenomena, but it's consolidating, aggregating that information into a single value. So raster cells are often, the value that we have in them is typically going to be computed or calculated from that variation. So, for example, think about a satellite image in a pixel size of 1 kilometer on a side. that can potentially encompass a lot of different types of surfaces. Imagine a pond with grassy vegetation around its margins that slowly grades into more shrubby types of vegetation and eventually a forest. And all of that can be easily contained within that 1 kilometer resolution pixel. So when the satellite takes an image and takes a reading of that area, the information in that pixel is going to be comprised of, well, however that satellite is collecting it, usually electromagnetic radiation reflected off of the surface. So different shades of blue and green, for example, and brown. What's the value that actually gets recorded in this cell and then gets reported back to the Earth's surface that we can combine it back into a satellite image composite, or use the value measurement of the radiation to do analysis, right? So depending upon the nature of your raster, you need to understand that the values that you're actually looking at, the phenomena that are recorded in that raster, may be amalgamations, aggregations of several different data types you might be interested in. And we may not be able to disaggregate those given the nature of the raster data. So how can we generate and create rasters? From points, lines, and polygon information. So from the vector data model, if you have vector data, it can be transformed into rasters. You can generate rasters from vector data. So a couple of examples from this table, from our secondary text. From points, you can say, where is the nearest hospital? And generate a grid of cell values that indicate distances from that point or multiple point locations, distances to the nearest hospital, or from a road, distances to the nearest road. What vegetation type is contained within a particular polygon or a set of polygons that describe a study area. What is the elevation if we have either point location of known GPS points, or perhaps we have contour lines that were created or traced off of a topographic map, and we know the elevation of those topo lines. We know the value of each line in elevation. We can convert that into a raster. And so, when you get one of these things, it may have been generated any number of ways. And typically, we will get rasters formed from initial vector data. So raster cells contain a value. They're almost always squares with the same size lines on each side, describing an area. When we think about scale and resolution with regard to raster information, when we want more detailed information, we're going to need a smaller cell size. Okay, so for example here, let's say the cell on the left is 20 meters on a side. Okay, and so we have a value of 7 just for that area, and we get a better scientific instrument that takes a measurement of the Earth's surface and is able to use 10 meter pixels. So for the same area on the left and the right, we have one value recorded at the 20 meter resolution. At 10 meter resolution, we're able to subdivide the same area into 4 pixels. Okay, so that's known as getting higher spatial resolution raster data. And with remote sensing data these days coming from drones and rockets and other things, I'm talking about little rockets that the kids can fire up from the playground. We can get very high resolution data. From satellites, we are more limited because of the distance that they're away from the Earth's surface and the type of sensors that are on them. But lower spatial resolution means a larger cell size. Higher spatial resolution or finer resolution is a smaller cell size. The lower cell size information is also known as more coarse. So if you're comparing any two given raster data sets, one may be coarser with a larger cell size, one may be finer with a smaller cell size. So rasters typically have one value contained within the pixels, and those values can be linked to a value attribute table for integer data types only, as the slide points out. So for categorical or nominal levels of measurement or types of information, we can assign other values or other attributes to the raster. So here's an example. We have a raster showing land use or land cover types for a really small area. We have values in the pixels of 1 through 4. We have a count how many there are of those pixels within the array. And then the value attribute table tells us what those codes mean. So value of 1 is forest, value of 2 is wetland, 3 is crops, 4 is urbanized area. Okay, so here's where we can do things. It's hard to do certain kinds of analysis on this, but at least we know, well, what is the purpose of the land surface or excuse me, the land use type, the cover type within the raster. That's something that we know from this data. How much area it covers in total, and some idea over there, the code, we don't know exactly what that means, but it's a code for something or other in a particular analysis.